Dear Heavenly God, we thank you so much for bringing us all here together. We pray that you'll help us to understand these articles and their implications, and help us to understand what's going on around us and how we can benefit, how we can do our part to help our neighbors. And we pray, Lord, that you'll fill us with your Holy Spirit, give us wisdom, understanding, discernment, faith, hope, courage, and humility. And we pray all this in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, so I ran across this. I can't remember if I found it before we were studying or after, but I was in particular trying to find the timeline of kind of a simple timeline. This is a very lengthy article, but a simple timeline for the 2021 and all that led up to February 2022 with the invasion. And so I started reading this on Sabbath when we were finished, and it's a long one. I took a couple breaks, and I was wiped out by the time the day was over. But it was
So,
go ahead, sorry.
where did you get this article?
Where did I get it?
Yeah,
Why?
where did this?
You know what? I meant to put the top there, but I think it was Washington Post.
Okay.
I meant to put that at the top, and I can look it up again, find the title and look it up again. But I was trying to look into the timeline that would help us understand Panium, because we were kind of talking about that on the Sabbath, and to better understand Panium. So when I ran across this, I was like, wow, this really just details the things that happened all along the way. We did talk about it because it may have been Madison, I think. Somebody put in, because I wasn't sure about a particular date on something. So there was something that did take place in July, and we'll go through that. But I think the big event leading to the big one was in December, when Biden used information war, Putin's own information. When they had intelligence all the time of what Putin was doing, a lot of things that Putin was doing, and they made the decision to make it public in December. So, and I'm pretty sure, maybe somebody will remember better than I do, but I'm pretty sure that was something that Elder Tess mentioned. And I didn't go back and watch that presentation, but I know she did a presentation sometime in 2022. Maybe somebody remembers. I got to go back and find it. I'm sure it's on the Midnight Watch anyways, on Panium, or detailing out, the things that were happening. So
You might want to add to this article the date, because we go through this stuff all the time. So where it says August 16th, add the year 2022.
Yeah. Was it, what'd you say it was?
2022.
Yeah. I can't do it in here because I've got the PDF open.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
But yeah, I made her change it in the other one. So take note, I guess, that it is. And if anybody gets the link out of there, it does say 2022.
Okay.
So yeah, I thought about that before and I didn't fix it earlier. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Because it is good to always know when it's written. You can kind of tell when you read it, but yeah. Okay, so this was the road to war. U.S. struggled to convince allies and Zelensky of the risk of invasion. And it is a Washington Post article. There was something else I wanted to do first, but okay, then we'll just do this. Okay, so I'll read a little bit and then pass it on. Is it big enough for everybody? Everybody's okay?
Maybe a little bigger.
A little bigger?
A little bigger if you can.
Better?
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, August 16, 2022. On a sunny October morning, the nation's top intelligence, military, and diplomatic leaders filed into the Oval Office for an urgent meeting with President Biden. They arrived bearing a highly classified intelligence analysis compiled from newly obtained satellite images, intercepted communications, and human sources that amounted to Russian President Vladimir Putin's war plans for a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I think we all remember that. I mean, I was remembering it more so as I read the article, but I'd kind of not given it thought for a long time. But if you remember, during 2021, towards the end of 2021, we kept hearing all these things of what Putin was doing, and he's building up this massive of his armies on the borders of Ukraine. If everybody remembers that. So this is detailing what was going on. So for months, Biden administration officials had watched warily as Putin massed tens of thousands of troops and lined up tanks and missiles along Ukraine's borders. Thank you for putting that. Is that Gloria? Thank you, Gloria, for putting that there. Along Ukraine's borders. As summer waned, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, had focused on the increasing volume of intelligence related to Russia and Ukraine. He had set up the Oval Office meeting after his own thinking had gone from uncertainty about Russia's intentions to concern he was being too skeptical about the prospects of military action to alarm. So the key takeaways, key takeaways on the road to war. The session was this Oval Office session, and it said summer, right? On a sunny October morning. So this is going to be October 21 that it's referring to there. The session was one of several meetings that officials had about Ukraine that autumn, sometimes gathering in smaller groups, but was notable for the detailed intelligence picture that was presented. Biden and Vice President Harris took their places in armchairs before the fireplace, while Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and General Mark A. Milley, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, joined the Directors of National Intelligence and the CIA on sofas around the coffee table. Tasked by Sullivan with putting together a comprehensive overview of Russia's intentions, they told Biden that the intelligence on Putin's operational plans, added to the ongoing deployments along the border with Ukraine, showed that all the pieces were now in place for a massive assault. The U.S. intelligence community had penetrated multiple points of Russia's political leadership, spying apparatus, and military, from senior levels to the front lines, according to U.S. officials. Much more radical than Moscow's 2014 annexation of Crimea and instigation of a separatist movement in eastern Ukraine, Putin's war plans envisioned a takeover of most of the country. And so they have this intelligence mapping this out from satellites, it said, and human sources. I think it said one other thing as well. But they had a lot of intelligence on what Putin was doing. A lot of strong evidence that showed what he was doing. Using mounted maps on easels in front of the Resolute desk, Milley showed Russian troop positions and the Ukrainian terrain they intended to conquer. It was a plan of staggering audacity, one that could pose a direct threat to NATO's eastern flank, or even destroy the post-World War II security architecture of Europe. As he absorbed the briefing, Biden, who had taken office promising to keep the country out of new wars, was determined that Putin must either be deterred or confronted, and that the United States must not act alone. Yet NATO was far from unified on how to deal with Moscow, and US credibility was weak. So if you think about 2021, after 4 years of Trump, where Trump had taken the United States, you've got NATO that's not unified and the USA not looking strong either. And all this is happening in Ukraine. Yet NATO was, after a disastrous occupation of Iraq, the chaos that followed the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and 4 years of Donald Trump seeking to undermine the alliance, it was far from certain that Biden could effectively lead a Western response to an expansionist Russia. So it wasn't, the way I understand that, it wasn't looking good to be able to navigate this crisis. with the state of things in multiple places. General Mark A. Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That one needed to come out of there. I thought I got them all out. It was a picture that was there. So Ukraine was a troubled former Soviet republic with a history of corruption, and a U.S. and allied answer to earlier Russian aggression there had been uncertain and divided. When the invasion came, the Ukrainians would need significant new weaponry to defend themselves. Too little could guarantee a Russian victory, but too much might provoke a direct NATO conflict with nuclear-armed Russia. Somebody want to restate that, what they're saying in that paragraph? Just to keep us all engaged here and involved, because it's a pretty good article. What are they?
You mean MAD? Are you talking about MAD, mutual assured destruction? So they're very careful.
Yeah, well, I guess that would be kind of in there, because you know that he's got a vast amount of nuclear weapons, but he's also, I don't know if madman is the right words to use, but he's pretty out there and into a desperate, eventually got into a desperate situation. So nobody really knew what he might do. So two things. If they didn't do it, if there wasn't a strong enough reaction and help support, then it would guarantee Russian victory. But if the US, I don't know if it just means the US, but if the US and all the allies would do too much, it might provoke him. So that kind of becomes part of the theme through here too, about not wanting to provoke Putin. So I kind of thought about it as walking a tightrope and, trying to be cautious either way as to what to do. Anybody else have thoughts on that? So you do have the MAD as well, mutual assured destruction. Okay, so this account is previously unreported detail. This account in previously unreported detail shines new light on the uphill climb to restore U.S. credibility, the attempt to balance secrecy around intelligence with the need to persuade others of its truth. So this fine line that Biden had to walk in, and it goes in a little bit more detail about balancing secrecy when it comes to intelligence, and yet still try to persuade the others of the truth in order to get them engaged and on board. And a challenge of determining how the world's most powerful military alliance would help a less than perfect democracy on Russia's border defy an attack without NATO firing a shot. So how to pull this off without provoking Putin, making sure that you have a strong enough aggression against, against this offensive against it, without being so strong that you provoke him, but also about the U.S. credibility being in the place that it was, and now trying to balance the secrecy around intelligence, but yet still get those that you need to be secretive about, what information to give them that would convince them, and Zelensky, you'll see too as we read through this, to convince them what Putin is doing in order to be able to support Ukraine. And then commenting on Ukraine being a less than perfect democracy. This powerful military alliance would help a less than perfect democracy on Russia's border. So, because if you remember the history of Ukraine, there was a lot of corruption going on in Ukraine over the past many years. And what was it? Maybe somebody remembers there was 2 different takeovers, I want to say. I may have that wrong the way I'm saying it. Revolutions, I think is what I was trying to say. And it kind of talks about that a little bit too, if I remember right. So Ukraine, if you remember right, when Trump was withholding the money, back when Trump was in office and he's withholding the money, all that talk was going on about, which way is Zelensky going to be? And they're accusing Ukraine of being corrupt, and Ukraine had been corrupt, but it's like, what's Zelensky going to be? Zelensky was wanting to clean it all up, but others had promised to want to clean it all up, and they wound up just as corrupt, if not more corrupt. But Zelensky still, in this new position, he's got a lot of corrupt people still that are not weeded out. So the first in a series of articles examining the road to war and the military campaign in Ukraine, it is drawn from in-depth interviews with more than 36 senior U.S., Ukrainian, European, and NATO officials about a global crisis whose end is yet to be determined. Some spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive intelligence and internal deliberations. The Kremlin did not respond. As Milley laid out the array of forces on that October morning, he and the others summed up Putin's intentions, quoting, "We assess that they plan to conduct a significant strategic attack on Ukraine from multiple directions simultaneously." Their version of shock and awe, taking that from, was that the Gulf War, or was that was the Gulf War they used that phrase in, wasn't it? Shock and awe. Not the Iraq War, but the Gulf War with George Bush Sr. Is that right? If he remembers that. Okay. So Putin is set up to do quite the onslaught on Ukraine, and the US has intelligence to prove it. According to the intelligence, the Russians would come from the north on either side of Kiev. One force would move east of the capital through the Ukrainian city of Chernihiv, while the other would flank Kiev on the west, pushing southward from Belarus through a natural gap between the exclusion zone at the abandoned Chernobyl nuclear plant and surrounding marshland. The attack would happen in the winter so that the hard earth would make terrain easily passable for tanks, forming a pincer around the capital. Does anybody know what a pincer is? I don't remember if I looked that word up.
Yes, pincer is if you imagine like the crab pinchers, it's coming together from, like, you start from one point and then you surround and it comes together.
Okay. Thank you. So, and remember, this is October that they're having this meeting, 2021 October. So forming a pincer around the capital, Russian troops plan to seize Kiev in 3 to 4 days. The Spetsnaz, their special forces, would find and remove President Vladimir Zelensky, killing him if necessary, and install a Kremlin-friendly puppet government. Separately, Russian forces would come from the east and drive through central Ukraine to the Dnieper River, while troops from Crimea took over the southeastern coast. Those actions could take several weeks, the Russian plans predicted. After pausing to regroup and rearm, they would next push westward toward a north-south line stretching from Moldova to western Belarus, leaving a rump Ukrainian state in the west, an area that in Putin's calculus was populated by irredeemable neo-Nazi Russophobes, Russian phobes.
To answer your question about the shock and awe, it says before the 2003 invasion of Iraq, United States Armed Forces officials described their plan as employing shock and awe, and the president in 2003 was George W. Bush
Oh,
Jr.
Junior, okay. Thank you. I was thinking it was the other one, but thank you. Does somebody else like to read?
I can read.
Okay.
The United States had obtained extraordinary detail about the Kremlin's secret plans for a war it continued to deny it attended. Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, later explained. They included not only the positioning of troops and weaponry and operational strategy, but also fine points such as Putin's unusual and sharp increases in funding for military contingency operations, for building up reserve forces, even as other pressing needs such as pandemic response were under-resourced, she said. This was no mere exercise in intimidation. Unlike a large-scale Russian deployment in April, when Putin's forces had menaced Ukraine's borders, but never attacked.
So this was going on, if I remember right, throughout much of 2021. Does anybody remember what they call them, the little green men? Was that when they went into Crimea?
Yeah, the little gray men was Crimea.
Yeah, where they had no what do you call it, like signatory? I don't know if that's what you call it, signatory, that showed on their what the uniforms or whatever outfits where they were wearing, insignia, maybe that's the word. Nothing showing that they were in Putin. And I remember the call, Obama was on the phone with Putin. So I'm pretty sure they have that recorded on video. And he's like, I see what you're doing. They could see what he was doing and he was denying it. And this one here says they have extraordinary detail of these secret plans, but it's secret plans to something that the Kremlin continued to deny.
Some in the White House found it hard to wrap their minds around the scale of the Russian leader's ambitions. It did not seem like the kind of thing that a rational country would undertake. One participant in the meeting later said of the planned occupation of most of the country of 232,000 square miles and nearly 45 million people. Parts of Ukraine were deeply anti-Russian, raising the specter of an insurgency even if Putin toppled the government in Kiev. And yet the intelligence showed that more and more troops were arriving and settling in for a full campaign. Munitions, food, and crucial supplies were being deposited at Russian encampments. Biden pressed his advisors. Did they really think that this time Putin was likely to strike? Yes, they affirmed, this is real. Although the administration would publicly insist over the next several months that it did not believe Putin had made a final decision, the only thing his team couldn't tell the president that autumn day was exactly when the Russian president would pull the trigger. CIA Director William J. Burns, who had served as U.S. ambassador to Moscow and had had the most direct interaction with Putin of anyone in the Biden administration, described the Russian leader to the others as fixated on Ukraine. Control over the country was synonymous with Putin's concept of Russian identity and authority. The precision of the war planning, coupled with Putin's conviction that Ukraine should be reabsorbed by the motherland, left him with no doubts that Putin was prepared to invade.
So didn't we, I know I read, but I think we read it together as well, the article that talked about somewhat of the history of Russia and Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, is that what he was? We read that together, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. That's what I thought. That showed Putin's obsession with his anti-Americanism and obsession with Ukraine and building back up the USSR.
Right. And I think it was or which Russian president was it that gave Ukraine to Crimea back to Ukraine?
Yeah, that was back a while ago.
Yeah. I believe he was quite serious, Burns said months later, recalling the briefing. The intelligence had underscored the promise of Putin's own words. 3 months earlier, in July, he had published a 7,000-word essay on the historical unity between Russians and Ukrainians. Suffused with grievance and dubious assertions. Russians and Ukrainians, he argued, were one people, an idea rooted in Putin's claims about blood ties, and Moscow had been robbed of its own territory by a scheming West. I am confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia, Putin wrote. Just weeks before the essay appeared, Biden and Putin had held a June 16 summit that both declared was constructive. At that point, Ukraine was a concern, but one that White House officials felt could be dealt with. As the White House delegation left the meeting held in Geneva, a senior Biden aide would later recall, "We didn't get on the plane and come home and think the world was on the cusp of a major war in Europe." But Putin's subsequent publication caught our attention in a big way, Sullivan later said. We began to look at what's going on here, what his end game. How hard is he going to push? As a precaution, on August 27, Biden authorized that $60 million in largely defensive weapons be drawn from U.S. inventories and sent to Ukraine.
So I was just kind of, since you're reading, I'm going to take a couple of notes. So June 16th is this summit that both Putin and Biden declared was constructive. And this is June 16th was just before where it talks about, see, because up here I think that, yeah, 3 months earlier. Oh, so in July is when he publishes his 7,000-word essay and says that Ukraine is possible only in partnership, true sovereignty with Ukraine partnership with Russia.
By late summer, as they pieced together the intelligence from the border and from Moscow, analysts who had spent their careers studying Putin were increasingly convinced the Russian leader, himself a former intelligence officer, saw a window of opportunity closing. Ukrainians had already twice risen up to demand a democratic future free from corruption and Moscow's interference during the 2004-2005 Orange Revolution and the 2013 and 2014 Maidan protest that preceded Russia's annexation of Crimea. While not a member of NATO or the European Union, Ukraine was now moving steadily into the Western political, economic, and cultural orbit. That drift fed Putin's broader resentment about Russia's loss of empire. In a grim actuarial assessment, the analysts concluded that Putin, who was about to turn 69, understood that he was running out of time to cement his legacy as one of Russia's great leaders, the one who had restored Russian preeminence on the Eurasian continent.
So he has mighty aspirations. And imagine they go in and it's almost, to me, it seemed more and more visible. I mean, I've always known how wrong it was, but I think I'm understanding it even more. His only purpose in doing it was his own selfish gain and pride, and there was no reason to go in there and attack them. But he then has everyone convinced that they're the victim. And anyway, so go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I was just thinking, you know, this grandeur of Putin here.
Is
The
what?
Grand Actuarial Assessment, the analyst concluded that Putin, who was about to turn 69, understood that he was running out of time to cement his legacy as one of Russia's leaders.
You kind of faded a little bit.
The one who had restored Russian preeminence on the Eurasian continent. So this was 2021. That was Panium. Then that was Beneventum.
Right.
Beneventum is when, which is the war, going back to Pyrrhus. Which was it Beneventum or another war that when Pyrrhus lost, he went down to Africa and he was going to amass this great army, navy, come all the way around, conquer and defeat Rome. Was that Beneventum? Was it another war?
You know, I'm trying to remember where I pulled Beneventum from. I think it was in a conversation with Susan, because actually wasn't Beneventum 2018 Midnight Cry? Or no,
No,
that was Heraclea.
Beneventum is this one, 2021. This
It is
is when the
2021, okay.
elephants turn on
Right.
Pyrrhus.
Right.
Yeah, and sort of.
Okay. So it was 2021. Okay.
I think that one maybe be Asculum or Heraclea fell. I can't remember.
2018 was Heraclea. Yeah, I remember.
Okay.
No, no, 2018 is the Asculum.
I'm glad that Luke, I don't think Luke's with us tonight, but glad that Luke's going to review that for us. So that'll be,
Yeah.
well, he's
that
not
would be
reviewing
helpful.
Pyrrhus. He's reviewing Acts 27, I think, right? I think he's reviewing Acts 27. I'll look it up for the next time that because I have plenty of the notes and we'll just pull
Oh,
up.
yeah, I think it's Heraclea 2018, and then 2019 is Asculum,
Right,
and then 2016 is Ipsus.
right. So 2018. Yeah, I remember that one because I did that study. Okay, so Beneventum was Panium 2021.
Okay.
And it was when, I think Gloria said it, and I think Gloria said it. It was when the elephant turned on Pyrrhus. His own elephant
Yes.
turned on him.
So that's information, or
Right.
that turn on. He's so I think the important thing is Biden is the one that asked Zelensky to clean up the corruption, and Zelensky, mistreated Putin's ally, and I think that got him really angry. And also, Ukraine wanting to join NATO. I think those two things really angered him to attack. From what I understand from the war of narratives there from Elder Test's presentation.
Yeah, I need to go back and review that. You put it in the chat, I saw.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. The analyst said Putin calculated that any Western response to an attempt to reclaim Ukraine by force would be big on outrage, but limited in actual punishment. The Russian leader, they said, believed that the Biden administration was chastened by the humiliating US withdrawal from Afghanistan and wanted to avoid new wars. The United States.
Do you remember the article that we also read? It was one that was in the media broadcast about how the United States enemies underestimate the United States?
Yes,
You remember that? Because that's what that
Yes.
reminds me of right there, that Putin is underestimating what the United States could do.
right.
And he's looking at the humiliation of Afghanistan and probably a bit about Trump too, even though he was friends with Trump, but he knows that the US is kind of sitting back there probably licking, or he's assuming the US is back there licking their wounds.
Hmm. Yeah, because that Afghanistan withdrawal, it wasn't good.
Was bad, yes.
Yeah. The United States and Europe were still struggling through the coronavirus pandemic. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, the de facto European leader, was leaving office and handing power to an untested successor. French President Emmanuel Macron was facing a re-election battle against a resurgent right wing, and Britain was suffering from a post-Brexit economic downturn. Large parts of the continent depended on Russian oil and natural gas, which Putin thought he could use as a wedge to split the Western alliance. He had built up hundreds of billions of dollars in cash reserves and was confident the Russian economy could weather the inevitable sanctions as it had in the past.
So that paragraph struck me as looking at it, because Biden has this task. They have this information, they see it, they know it's going to happen. They don't know when, they see how massive it is. And he's going to try to rally the allies and get Zelensky and find ways to get Zelensky informed and on board, even though he's still surrounded by corrupt people within his administration. And the task that Biden has to do to get everyone on board to do this. So you see the disarray that basically they're all in, if that made sense.
Right. And I would say Putin's calculation was correct.
Yeah. But he underestimated
Yes,
the States' ability to pull out of that.
yes. Presented with a new intelligence and analysis at the October briefing, Biden basically had two reactions, Sullivan said. First, to try to deter Putin, they needed to send somebody to Moscow to sit with the Russians at a senior level and tell them, if you do this, this will be the consequences. Yeah, but I think Putin was already figuring out the consequences. Second, they needed to brief allies on the US intelligence and bring them on board with what the administration believed should be a unified and severe posture of threatened sanctions against Russia, reinforcement and expansion of NATO defenses, and assistance for Ukraine. Burns was dispatched to Moscow and Haynes to NATO headquarters in Brussels. Months later, Milley still carried in his briefcase note cards encapsulating the US interests and strategic objectives discussed at the October briefing. He could recite them off the top of his head. Problem: how do you underwrite and enforce the rules-based international order against a country with extraordinary nuclear capability without going to World War III? Number one, don't have a kinetic conflict between the US military and the NATO with Russia. Number two, contain war inside the geographical boundaries of Ukraine. And number three, strengthen and maintain NATO unity. And number four, empower Ukraine and give them the means to fight. Biden's advisors were confident Ukraine would put up a fight. The United States, Britain, and other NATO members had spent years training and equipping the Ukrainian military, which was more professional and better organized than before Russia's assault on Crimea and the eastern region of Donbass 7 years earlier. But the training had focused nearly as much on how to mount internal resistance after a Russian occupation as on how to prevent it in the first place. The weapons they had supplied were primarily small bore defensive so that they wouldn't be seen as a Western provocation.
He's trying not to provoke Putin.
Right.
Kind of seemed like an awful bit of balance was happening, a balancing act to do this.
Yes, he was walking a tightrope.
Yeah,
So here's the breakdown of billions of dollars in US military aid to Ukraine.
that's another link for another article.
Oh, okay. The administration also have had grave concerns about Ukraine's young president, a former television comic who had come into office on a huge wave of popular support and desire for fundamental change, but had lost public standing in part because he failed to make good on a promise to make peace with Russia. Zelensky, 44, appeared to be no match for the ruthless Putin.
So you kind of see, or at least I did anyways, help me if I'm seeing this wrong. You can see that Putin kind of does appear to have some advantage there, or at least looking at all the obstacles that were in play and what it took to get it all together.
Yes,
You know, Zelensky, they don't know how he's going to be in all this. He doesn't have a record that looks real good yet. Then the European Union being the mess that it was. So things were kind of stacked to, it was like action had to be taken, and the action had to be careful action and precise. I thought it was a really interesting read.
math was not in Ukraine's favor. Russia had more troops, more tanks, more artillery, more fighter jets and guided missiles, and had demonstrated in previous conflicts its willingness to pummel its weaker adversaries into submission with no regard for the loss of civilian lives. Yes, we can see that. Kiev might not fall as quickly as the Russians expected, the Americans concluded, but it would fall. On November 2nd, Burns was escorted into Kremlin office of Yuri Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy advisor and a former ambassador to the United States. Ushakov's boss was on the other end of a phone line and spoke to Burns from the resort city of Sochi, where he had retreated during another wave of coronavirus infections in Moscow. The Russian leader recited his usual complaints about NATO expansion, the threat to Russian security, and illegitimate leadership in Ukraine.
So
He was very dismissive of President Zelensky as a political leader.
yeah, he's calling Zelensky an illegitimate leader.
Yes.
I guess just because he wasn't a puppet for Putin.
Right. And
He was elected.
he was democratically elected.
Yeah.
Practiced at listening to Putin's tirades from his years in Moscow, Burns delivered his own forceful message. The United States knows what you are up to, and if you invade Ukraine, you will pay a huge price. He said he was leaving a letter from Biden affirming the punishing consequences of any Russian attack on Ukraine. Putin was very matter-of-fact, Burns says. He didn't deny the intelligence that pointed toward a Russian invasion of Ukraine. The CIA director also met with another of Putin's advisors, Nikolai Patrushev, an ex-KGB officer from Putin's hometown of St. Petersburg, who ran Russia's Security Council. Patrushev had thought Burns flew to Moscow to discuss the next meeting between Putin and Biden, and seemed surprised that the CIA chief had come bearing a warning about Ukraine. He almost exactly echoed Putin's grievances about history and NATO and his discussions with Burns. There seemed to be no room for meaningful engagement, and it left the CIA director to wonder if Putin and his tight circle of aides had formed their own echo chamber. Putin had not made an irreversible decision to go to war, but his views on Ukraine had hardened. His appetite for risk had grown, and the Russian leader believed his moment of opportunity would soon pass. My level of concern has gone up, not down, the spy chief reported back to Biden. As Burns was speaking to Putin, Blinken was sitting down with Zelensky in Glasgow, Scotland, on the sidelines of an international summit on climate change. He laid out the intelligence picture and described the Russian storm that was heading Ukraine's way. It was just the two of us, 2 feet from each other, Blinken recalled. It was a difficult conversation. Blinken had met before with the Ukrainian president and thought he knew him well enough to speak candidly, although it seems surreal to be telling someone you believe their country is going to be invaded. He found Zelensky serious, deliberate, stoic, a combination of belief and disbelief. He said he would brief his senior teams, but the Ukrainians had seen a number of Russian feints in the past, Blinken knew, and Zelensky was clearly worried about economic collapse if his country panicked.
Yeah, so Zelensky didn't want to warn his country, and didn't. Choice that he made.
Lincoln's presentation and Zelensky's skepticism set a pattern that would be repeated both privately and in public over the next several months. The Ukrainians could not afford to reject US intelligence wholesale, but from their perspective, the information was speculative. Zelensky heard the US warnings, he later recalled, but said the Americans weren't offering the kinds of weapons Ukraine needed to defend itself. You can say a million times, listen, there may be an invasion. Okay, there may be an invasion. Will you give us planes? Zelensky said. Will you give us air defenses? Well, you're not a member of NATO. Ah, okay. Then what are we talking about? The Americans offered little specific intelligence to support their warnings until the last 4 or 5 days before the invasion began, according to Dmytro Kuleba, Zelensky's foreign minister. Less than 2 weeks after the Glasgow meeting, when Kuleba and Andriy Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff, visited the State Department in Washington, a senior US official greeted them with a cup of coffee and a smile. Guys, dig the trenches, the official began.
So from what we said here, that the Americans didn't give specific intelligence to support. So they weren't giving everything. I think it talks about why as you go through here. I don't think that's what you just read. Yeah.
When we smiled back, Kuleba recalled, the official said, "I'm serious. Start digging trenches. You will be attacked. A large-scale attack, and you have to prepare for it." We asked for details. There were none. If the Americans became frustrated at Ukraine's skepticism about Russia's plans, the Ukrainians were no less disconcerted at the increasingly public US warnings that an invasion was coming. We had to strike a balance between realistically assessing the risks and preparing the country for the worst and keeping the country running economically and financially, Kuleba said. Every comment coming from the United States about the unavoidability of war was immediately reflected in the Ukrainian currency exchange rate. A number of US officials have disputed Ukrainian recollections, saying they provided the Kiev government with specific intelligence early on and throughout the lead up to the invasion. Yet, when it came to Ukraine, US intelligence was hardly an open book. Official guidance prohibited the spy agencies from sharing tactical information that Ukraine could use to launch offensive attacks on Russian troop locations in Crimea or against Kremlin-backed separatists in the east.
I have a question. What do you think happened in that Ukraine exchange there, the currency? What went on? Not familiar too much about wars, but
It was referring back to previously where it said where Zelensky, he didn't want to warn his people if they knew, because it was going to directly affect their economy. I think that's what they're talking about. Well, this here is just talking specifically about the exchange rate, huh? Well, that's why you're bringing it up. But every comment coming from the United States about the unavoidability of war was immediately reflected in the Ukraine currency exchange rate. So it was hurting Ukraine, if I understand that correctly, that the talk of war was, all the stuff, the comments coming from the United States about this war was hurting Ukraine. That's the way I understood it. Anybody
you
else?
mean maybe like people are getting their money and fleeing the country, and so the economy is dropping in
That I
Ukraine?
think is mentioned later on too, that he didn't want people to flee as well, because he needed them there to stay and fight.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think it goes into it a little bit, but I don't know if it's talking about currency exchange rate. That's talking about like when you take your US dollar and do the exchange. That's what that's referring to, right?
Yeah, so they did not want their value of money to drop.
To decrease, right?
Yes.
I think you're right here.
Mary wrote a nice comment there. Mary, you can say or
Devaluation of Ukrainian currency due to looming war. Yeah, thank you.
Ukraine's own intelligence apparatus was also shot through with Russian moles, and US officials were leery of sensitive information ending up in Moscow's hands. After the war began, the Biden administration changed its policy and shared information on Russian troop movements throughout Ukraine, on the grounds that the country was now defending itself from an invasion. At a side meeting during the Group of 20 conferences in Rome at the end of October, Biden shared some of the new intelligence and conclusions with America's closest allies, the leaders of Britain, France, and Germany. In mid-November, Haynes used a previously scheduled trip to Brussels to brief a wider circle of allies. NATO's North Atlantic Council, the principal decision-making body of the 30-member alliance. Speaking in a large auditorium, she limited her remarks to what the intelligence community believed the evidence showed and didn't offer policy recommendations.
So they're starting in October to share what says some of the new intelligence and conclusions. So they're starting in October, if I follow that correctly, to share more information with closest allies, Britain, France, and Germany.
Yes,
And in mid-November, they're including a wider circle of allies.
yes.
Okay.
A number of members raised questions and were skeptical of the idea that President Putin was seriously preparing for the possibility of a large-scale invasion, Haynes recalled. French and German officials couldn't understand why Putin would try to invade and occupy a large country with just the 80,000 to 90,000 troops believed to be massed on the border. Satellite imagery also showed the troops moving back and forth from the frontier. Others posited that the Russians were performing an exercise, as the Kremlin itself insisted, or playing a shell game designed to conceal a purpose short of invasion. Most were doubtful and noted that Zelensky seemed to think Russia would never attack with the ambition and force the Americans were forecasting. Didn't Ukraine understand Russia's intentions best? Only the British and the Baltic states were fully on board. At one point, an official from London stood up and gestured toward Haynes. "She's right," the official said. But Paris and Berlin remembered emphatic US claims about intelligence on Iraq. The shadow of that deeply flawed analysis hung over all the discussions before the invasion. Some also felt that Washington, just months earlier, had vastly overestimated the resilience of Afghanistan's government as the US military was withdrawing. The government had collapsed as soon as the Taliban entered Kabul. American intelligence is not considered to be a naturally reliable source, said Francois Heisbourg, a security expert and long-term advisor to French officials. It was considered to be prone to political manipulation. The Europeans began to settle into camps that would change little for several months. "I think there were basically three flavors," a senior administration official said. To many in Western Europe, what the Russians were doing was all coercive diplomacy. Putin was just building up to see what he could get. He's not going to invade. It's crazy.
So all this was going on in that time, because I do remember it being out on the news a lot, reporting that they're seeing this troop buildup, and but so many of them weren't believing that it was really happening. What did it say? Britain and the Baltics were the only ones that were believing this.
Yes, they're the only ones who were in full board.
So I think Putin was, I think he started assembling the military in October, and he didn't invade until February of 2022. So about 4 months, everybody probably were wondering if he was going to attack or not.
And also, was it the French prime minister saying that Putin promised or told him he wasn't going to attack
I think that
just
comes up in
days
here too.
before?
I think that comes up in here too.
Okay.
I think. Now that you bring that up. I think that was right at the very, just before he actually invaded, like days before, if I remember right.
Mhm.
Many of NATO's newer members in Eastern and Southeastern Europe thought Putin may do something, but it would be limited in scope, the official said. Another bite at the Ukrainian apple, similar to what happened in 2014. But Britain and the Baltic states, which were always nervous about Russian intentions, believed a full-scale invasion was coming. When skeptical member states asked for more intelligence, the Americans provided some, but held back from sharing it all. Historically, the United States rarely revealed its most sensitive intelligence to an organization as diverse as NATO, primarily for fear that secrets could leak. While the Americans and their British partners did share a significant amount of information, they withheld the raw intercepts or nature of the human sources that were essential to determining Putin's plans. That especially frustrated French and German officials, who had long suspected that Washington and London sometimes hid the basis of their intelligence to make it seem more definitive than it really was. Some of the alliance countries provided their own findings, Haynes said. The United States also created new mechanisms for sharing information in real time with their foreign partners in Brussels. Austin, Blinken, and Milley were all on the phone to their counterparts, sharing, listening, cajoling. Over time, one senior European official in NATO recalled, the intelligence was narrated repeatedly, consistently, clearly, credibly, in a lot of detail with a very good script and supporting evidence. I don't remember one key moment where the light bulb went off in the months-long effort to convince the Allies, the official said. Ultimately, it was the volume of the lights in the room. Macron and Merkel had been dealing with Putin for years and found it hard to believe he was so irrational as to launch a calamitous war. In the weeks after Biden's Geneva meeting, they had tried to arrange an EU-Russian summit only to be shot down by skeptical members of the bloc who saw it as a dangerous concession to Russia's aggressive posture. Months later, despite the new US intelligence, the French and Germans insisted there was a chance for diplomacy. The Americans and the British had little hope that any diplomatic effort would pay off, but were prepared to keep the door open if the Europeans gave something in return. A big part of our focus, recalled Sullivan, was basically to say to them, look, we'll take the diplomatic track and treat it as serious if you will take the planning for military force, posture, and sanctions seriously. Each side was convinced it was right, but was willing to proceed as if it might be wrong. Over the next several months, the Americans strove to show the Western Europeans and others that they were still willing to search for a peaceful resolution, even though in the back of their minds, they were convinced that any Russian efforts at negotiation were a charade. It basically worked, Sullivan said of the administration strategy. On December 7th, Putin and Biden spoke on a video call. Putin claimed that the eastward expansion of the Western alliance was a major factor in his decision to send troops to Ukraine's border. Russia was simply protecting its own interests and territorial integrity, he argued. Biden responded that Ukraine was unlikely to join NATO at any time soon, and that the United States and Russia could come to agreement on other concerns Russia had about the placement of US weapons system in Europe. In theory, there was room to compromise. For a while, as Blinken headed the US diplomatic effort with repeated visits to NATO capitals and alliance headquarters in Brussels, the Ukrainians continued their contacts with the European government, and still seemed far less convinced of Putin's intentions than the Americans were. Kuleba and others in the government believed there would be a war, the Ukrainian foreign minister later said. But until the eve of the invasion, I could not believe that we would face a war of such scale. The only country in the world that was persistently telling us with such certainty that there would be missile strikes was the United States of America. Every other country was not sharing this analysis and instead was saying, yes, war is possible, but it will be rather a localized conflict in the east of Ukraine. Put yourself in our shoes, Kuleba said. You have, on one hand, the US telling you something completely unimaginable, and everyone else blinking an eye to you and saying this is not what we think is going to happen. In fact, the British and some Baltic officials believed a full invasion was probable. But Kuleba was far from alone in his skepticism. His president shared it, according to Zelensky's aides and other officials who briefed him. We took all of the information that our Western partners were giving us seriously, recalled Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff. But let's be honest. Imagine if all of this panic that so many people were pushing had taken place. Creating panic is a method of the Russians. Imagine if this panic had started 3 or 4 months before. What would have happened to the economy? Would we have been able to hold on for 5 months like we have? In early January, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman led a diplomatic delegation to Geneva and met with Sergei Ryabkov, her Russian counterpart, whom she knew well. He reiterated Moscow's position on Ukraine, formally offered in mid-December in 2 proposed treaties that NATO must end its expansion plans and halt any activity in countries that had joined the alliance after 1997, which included Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltic states. Rejecting the proposal to close NATO's doors and reduce the status of existing members, the administration instead offered talks and trust-building measures in a number of security areas, including the deployment of troops and the placement of weapons on NATO's eastern flank along the border with Russia. The offer was conditioned on de-escalation of the military threat to Ukraine. Ryabkov told Sherman that Russia was disappointed in the American attitude. The White House had envisioned Sherman's meeting with Ryabkov as a chance to test whether the Russians were serious about the substance of the concerns, and if there was a way forward for any kind of diplomacy, said Emily Horn, then the spokesperson for the National Security Council. I think it became pretty clear, pretty quickly, that the Russians were performing diplomacy, not actually undertaking diplomacy. They weren't even doing it with much seriousness.
What's the difference? Performing diplomacy, not actually undertaking diplomacy.
So performing diplomacy, it was performance.
Okay,
Yeah. They acted like,
they're not actually
Diplo-
doing it. Yeah, okay.
yeah, but not actually undertaking it. Would anybody else like to read?
I can.
Thank you.
At the top, all the Western allies.
Yes.
All the Western allies wanted to convey that there was an alternative path involving dialogue and respect for Russia as a great power, said a senior British government official involved in negotiations. What became increasingly clear was that Russia was not interested in those. As the United States pursued the diplomatic track, it also positioned forces to defend NATO, all of them visible to Moscow and to Europeans, and demonstrating American willingness to put skin in the game. While Biden repeatedly said there would be no US troops in Ukraine, the Pentagon increased pre-positioned weapons stocks in Poland and moved a helicopter battalion there from Greece. Paratroops from the 173rd Airborne were deployed to the Baltic states. More troops were sent from Italy to eastern Romania, and others went to Hungary and Bulgaria. Over the next several months, the US military presence in Europe increased from 74,000 to 100,000, so an extra 25,000 people. 4 airborne fighter squadrons became 12, and the number of surface combatant ships in the region increased from 5 to 26. Combat air patrols and surveillance were flying 24/7 missions over the alliance's eastern flank with visibility deep inside Ukraine. I didn't know that. I didn't know that they were being that visible.
Say that again.
I didn't realize the US was doing that. You know, that they were trying to, it seemed to me that they were trying to make it all real quiet. That, you know, that they weren't offering troops and stuff like that, but apparently they were doing more than we realized, or more than I realized. Anyway, I
Not
didn't
in
realize that.
Ukraine though, just in Europe, building up so that they're, I guess it would mean like they're building up to be close by.
Well, what about that last sentence where it says combat air patrols and surveillance were flying 24/7 missions over the alliance's eastern flank with visibility deep inside Ukraine. So on the eastern flank, so they could see it within Ukraine, right?
Yeah,
Right, okay. So yeah, I guess you're right. Not inside Ukraine, but so close that everybody could see it, that they were close. Okay, I got it.
is that kind of like a show of muscle?
I would think so, yeah. To show, you know, we're standing right here next to you. We're here if something breaks out.
We're not going to fight. We're not going to have boots on the ground, but we're here to support you. Intimidating, Troy said. Yeah.
So we were saying, look, we're taking diplomacy seriously, but we're so worried about this that we're actually moving men and material, Sullivan recalled.
Yeah, so they're still trying to be diplomatic, but they see what Russia's doing. We're gonna still show our, as Troy put it, intimidation out there.
With National Security Agency authorization, the United States established a direct communication line from the Ukrainian military to US European Command. The highly secure system would keep the Americans in direct contact with their Ukrainian counterparts as events unfolded. The administration was also sending arms to Ukraine. In December, Biden authorized an additional $200 million in weapons to be drawn from U.S. inventories, even as the Kiev government, many in Congress, and some within the administration itself argued that if the United States really believed a full-scale invasion was coming, it was not enough. But every step in the administration campaign was premised on avoiding direct U.S. involvement in a military clash. The overriding White House concern about provocation influenced each decision about how much assistance and what kind of weapons to give the Ukrainians to defend themselves. I make no apologies for the fact that one of our objectives here is to avoid direct conflict with Russia, Sullivan said, as the pre-war period. The Russians were going to do what they did regardless of what the Allies did, a senior official involved in the discussion said. And the administration found incredible the notion, as some later argued in hindsight, that if only we would have given the Ukrainians more arms, none of this would have happened. Determining whether Russia would interpret a military exercise or a weapons shipment as provocation or escalatory was more art than science, the official said. There's not a clear and easy mathematical formula. There has always been a balance between what is required to effectively defend and what is going to be seen by Russia as the United States essentially underwriting the killing of huge numbers of Russians. Ukrainian officials have expressed unending gratitude to the United States for what it has provided since the start of the war. Quote, no other country in the world did more for Ukraine to get the necessary weapons than the United States since 24th of February. No other country in the world, Kulba said recently. But from the beginning, he said, he and other Ukrainian officials have believed that the non-provocation strategy was the wrong one.
Yeah, so they, if I understood that correctly, because it was talking earlier on that they did not want to provoke Putin. And this is Ukraine saying that they didn't believe that that was the strategy to do. So they were saying they should have provoked Putin?
It's easy to say these things in hindsight, but Russia was, Putin was trying to provoke us into it. Wasn't he? Wasn't that part of his goal?
Yeah, Putin, but I'm talking about the United States. Biden didn't want to provoke Putin.
Right.
So because the US was looking early on, how are we going to handle this? How much do we give them? Because if we don't give them enough, Russia is going to beat them. And if we give them too much, we might provoke Putin. And I think that's what he's talking about, if I understood what you said.
Yes, and he was trying not to provoke him into a nuclear war. Yeah.
Right. So the Ukrainian officials believe that non-provocation, don't provoke Putin strategy was the wrong one. So if I flip that around, then what they were saying is that we should have provoked Putin. That's how I took that.
Well, not so much intentionally provoke Putin, but this, walking a tight line,
Of how
a
much to
fine
give them.
balance. It's a strategy of non-provocation. That strategy was incorrect. I think what the Ukrainian officials were saying, that if you really believe that we're going to be invaded, give us, put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah.
And give us the weapons to defend ourselves.
Right.
Yeah. Whether it provokes Putin or not is irrelevant.
Yeah.
And just a question or a thought on that too, on that point. I mean, there's been a lot of strategists now, of course, you're looking hindsight back, but they said if they had only stepped up and taken care of Putin, or, made sure that it was a provocation only because they needed to stop him before he got to the point where he is threatening a nuclear weapon. Should have been done before that.
Well, that's what
There, yeah.
Hillary would have been for.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's what that article was you sent me. I remember reading it before.
Yeah,
But that's
yeah.
what that was about. And because Hillary, he what's the words? Messed with the election. Can't think of the right words to use. Because he did not want Hillary to win. So Hillary on two fronts, if I follow that correctly, was the one she stood for human rights. She stood for equality. She stood up against bullies. She would have stood up against Putin.
Oh,
Putin
yeah.
would have been in a different place had we had 4 years of Hillary Clinton.
Yes.
But instead we had 4 years of Donald Trump that paved the way for this to happen. And even Afghanistan pulling out of Afghanistan was partially due to Trump setting up to do that, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, it was a Trump deal.
Yeah.
Yeah,
He was just
I don't know.
following
I
through
don't
with it.
know. Yeah, I mean, it was a Trump deal, and I don't know what, all the political nuances of why Biden had to abide by it. But apparently
Yeah.
Biden had to abide by it, and it was a mess.
Wasn't it something to do with the fact that it had already gone through, like he's the fourth president through all this, and it was just someone eventually had to do it, and Putin and Trump laid it all out, and Biden just went ahead and went with it. That's what I remember hearing. I don't know if that was accurate. Because he could have stopped it. I always thought that too. Why didn't he stop it? But I remember hearing something along the lines of it was just eventually it had to happen, but they did it really bad. I don't know if that was correct. That's what I remembered hearing. Mary put USA intervention was the only response. The bully had already charged and Ukrainians were already in grave danger.
Yeah.
So Hillary would have been the answer for all of this in 2016 when it comes to the King of the South and equality.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's how she handled Gaddafi.
Yeah.
It just a preliminary person there that was, but he needed to be controlled or stopped, Gaddafi, and what he was doing.
Yeah.
And she saw that very clearly.
And Putin saw that very clearly and
Yeah.
wanted him to be next.
Yeah, because he was a friend of Gaddafi's.
Right.
Putin was.
Any other comments? Where did it take us to? Kulba said, I think this war, with thousands killed and wounded, territories lost, part of the economy destroyed, is the best answer to those who still advocate the non-provocation of Russia. As part of its ongoing campaign to convince the world of what was coming and dissuade the Russians, the White House decided toward the end of 2021 to challenge its own reluctance, and that the intelligence agencies to make some of their most sensitive information public.
Can you read that one again?
Yeah.
I got distracted.
As part of its ongoing campaign to convince the world of what was coming and to dissuade the Russians, so try to stop them from doing what they're thinking about doing, the White House decided toward the end of 2021 to challenge its own reluctance and that of the intelligence agencies to make some of their most sensitive information public.
So this was when, and this was December, I believe. when he turns and uses the intelligence that they've gathered on Russia and expose it and put it out there, like information war,
Yeah,
Yeah,
and marking the end of 2021. So the year of 2021, I don't know that we mark where it begins, at least from the article, you go back to June 16th, but I'd have to go back. I want to watch the video that Gloria put in there to try to refresh my mind on some of that stuff. But my kind of purpose in this article, re-looking at Panium, to, you know, looking back at what happened, you know, because she's reviewed the various waymarks at different times, and the you know, how there's always a cause and effect. It's a period of time that happens, and there's usually significant events along the way, and that perhaps maybe we could, as we start reviewing Acts 27 and maybe Pyrrhus again, that we can then look at the Sunday law waymark, going back through Pyrrhus. And that might help us, I think, as we continue to watch this all unfold. That was my thinking anyways.
yeah, that sounds good. US intelligence had picked on false flag operations planned by the Russians, in which they would stage attacks on their own forces as if they had come from Ukraine. Publicly exposing those plans might deny Putin the opportunity to concoct a pretext for invasion, administration officials reasoned. As a first step, the White House decided to reveal the scale of the troop buildup that continued on Ukraine's borders. In early December, the administration released satellite photos as well a map created by US analysts showing Russian troop positions and an intelligence community analysis of Russian planning. The analysis said the Russians planned extensive movement of 100 battalion tactical groups involving up to 175,000 troops, along with armor, artillery, and equipment. The picture that administration officials had been developing for weeks in secret was now seen around the world. In anticipation of more selective disclosures of intelligence, Sullivan set up a regular process at the White House in which a team would determine whether a particular piece of information, if made public, could thwart Russian plans or propaganda. If the answer was yes, it would then be submitted to the intelligence community for recommendations on whether and how to release it. In late January, the British government publicly accused Russia of plotting to install a puppet regime in Kiev. The allegation, based on US and British intelligence, was revealed in a highly unusual press statement by Foreign Secretary Liz Truss late in the evening in London, but just in time for the Sunday morning papers.
So that was interesting to see her name in this, because how long was she in her position?
3 months,
Was it 3 months? I thought it was like 2 weeks. Maybe I had it wrong.
maybe, I'm not exactly sure, but she was in and she was out. Yeah, it could have been just a few weeks.
And in early February, the Biden administration disclosed that Moscow was considering filming a fake Ukrainian attack against Russian territory or Russian-speaking people, the false flag that intelligence had detected. The propaganda film would be heavy on spectacle, officials said, with graphic scenes of explosions accompanied by corpses posed as victims and mourners pretending to grieve for the dead. I had watched Putin falsely set the narrative too many times, another US official said. Now you could see him planning quite specifically in Eastern Ukraine false flags. It was quite precise. the intelligence disclosures themselves had an air of
Theatricality, theoretically. Theoretically, isn't that what that word is? The intelligence discloses themselves had an air of, oh, I think it's talking about theater.
I think it
Yes.
is too.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that's the way I read it before.
Theatricality.
Thank you. Theatricality. The initial revelation of satellite pictures could be corroborated by commercial footage, though the analysis was unique to the intelligence community. But whether the public believed the subsequent disclosures depended on the government's credibility. And Biden administration officials knew they faced a public at home and abroad that could be deeply skeptical of intelligence following the Iraq War and the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan.
And that's what I was thinking of, at least with the Iraq War, because I always remember Powell, was it Colin Powell?
Yeah,
When he went and said that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. Was that
Yeah.
what?
but they never proved it, right? Like,
They
but
were never found, no.
yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is they never showed the proof beforehand, right? They just said, we have intelligence that says they do, but they never showed us that intelligence, where in this
Yeah, but when you
case,
look at the technology today anyways, all the stuff that they were showing, all the evidence that they were showing, what if it wasn't real?
agreed, I agree,
So
yeah,
maybe they're skeptical, you know,
yes, agreed,
that is really real, especially if you're like a far left person who a non-interventionist far left person and sees the United States as a bully. You're not going to believe that either.
right, that's true. Broadly speaking, the US public information campaign worked. World attention focused on the Russian troop buildup. The idea that Putin could falsify the reason for his invasion seemed plausible. Perhaps because in 2014, he had denied entirely that his troops were in Crimea, an assertion that led to descriptions of little green men in military uniforms without insignia occupying part of Ukraine. So that answers that. I mean, like, there's two sides to it. So yes, Putin did this once before already. So he's got a pattern. He's done it already. And then number two, those satellites are available to everyone. So just because, I mean, we've been the US has been gathering this information, but anybody with access to those satellites and the map and stuff could get that same information. You know what I'm saying? So that
Yeah.
they can, so once they know about it, they can go looking for it and prove it in their own eyes with their own equipment.
Yeah.
Given how skeptical some allies remained about the intelligence, the most powerful effect of disclosing it was to shape Russian behavior and deprive Putin of the power to use misinformation, US officials said. On January 12th, Burns met in Kiev with Zelensky and delivered a candid assessment. The intelligence picture had only become clearer that Russia intended to make a lightning strike on Kiev and decapitate the central government. So going for the head, right?
Yeah.
The United States had also discovered a key piece of battlefield planning. Russia would try to land its forces first at the airport in Hostomel, a suburb of the capital, where the runways could accommodate massive Russian transports carrying troops and weapons. The assault on Kiev would begin there. Does anybody else want to read? I'm just checking. I don't want to take it over. If anybody else wants to read.
I can read if you're tired.
Okay, go ahead.
Are
At
you
one
tired?
point. I could keep reading. I'm just checking to see if anybody else wants to.
At one point in their conversation, Zelensky asked if he or his family were personally in danger. Burns said Zelensky needed to take his personal security seriously. The risks to the president were growing. Intelligence at the time indicated that Russian assassination teams might already be in Kiev, waiting to be activated. But Zelensky resisted calls to relocate his government and was adamant that he did not panic the public. Down that path, he thought, lay defeat. You can simply say to me, listen, you should start to prepare people now and tell them they need to put away money. They need to store up food, Zelensky recalled. If we had communicated that, and that is what some people wanted, who I will not name, then I would have been losing 7 billion a month since last October. And at that moment, when Russians did attack, they would have taken us in 3 days. Generally, our inner sense was right. If we sow chaos among people before the invasion, the Russians will devour us. Because during chaos, people flee the country. For Zelensky, the decision to keep people in the country where they could fight to defend their homes was the key to repelling any invasion. As cynical as it may sound, those are the people who stopped everything, he said.
Just kind of interesting to see how all these things played out. Because how they could have played out just makes me think about God directing certain features of things. Because you have the United States in a low point in credibility. You have the European Union and NATO not really all locked in together, and issues with each one of them. The issue of whether to to not send too little help and to send too much and what that may bring about. Not all the allies are on board and believe what the United States is sharing. Zelensky doesn't believe it. And then you have Zelensky himself not telling his people they get no warning. So imagine being a Ukrainian, you're living your life and you don't know any of this is going on, or maybe you do know some of it's going on, but everybody's being told nothing's going to happen. And then how it could have gone is people being really angry that they weren't informed. But what happened was they stood there and they stayed there and fought. And had they not fought the way they did, they would have been defeated.
Yeah,
Did that make sense? But it was like a lot of providence involved,
right.
is what it looks like to me. Kind of like what Ellen White said about the Civil War.
I kind of noticed that some of the key figures in the waymarks that we mark are entertainers. You have Ronald Reagan. You even have Donald Trump. And now you have Zelensky.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I don't think it's I don't think it's a coincidence.
You don't have a seasoned politician.
Yeah. That way the people don't see it coming. They really don't. Ukrainian officials remained irritated that the Americans weren't sharing more about their intelligence sources. The information that we received was, I will call it, a statement of fact without a disclosure of the origins of those facts or of the background behind those facts. Kuleba recalled.
So they just stated things as fact, but didn't prove it. Is that what they're saying?
They're telling them this is what we see, but we're not going to tell you where we got it, kind of
Right.
thing. But Western intelligence wasn't alone in thinking Zelensky should prepare for a full-scale invasion. Some of Ukraine's own intelligence officials, while still skeptical that Putin would strike, were planning for the worst. Kroilo Budonov, Ukraine's military intelligence chief, said he moved the archives out of his headquarters 3 months in advance of the war and prepared reserves of fuel and ammunition. The American warning was repeated on January 19th when Blinken made a brief visit to Kiev for a face-to-face meeting with Zelensky in Kuleba. To the secretary's dismay, Zelensky continued to argue that any public call for mobilization would bring panic, as well as capital flight that would push Ukraine's already teetering economy over the edge. While Blinken stressed, as he had in previous conversations, the importance of keeping Zelensky and his government safe and intact, he was one of the several senior US officials who rebuffed reports that the administration had urged them to evacuate the capital. What we said to Ukraine were two things, Blinken later recalled. We will support you whatever you want to do. We recommend you look at how you can ensure continuity of government operations depending on what happens. That could mean hunkering down in Kiev, relocating to the West, Ukraine, or moving the government to neighboring Poland. Zelensky told Blinken he was staying. He had begun to suspect that some Western officials wanted him to flee so that Russia could install a puppet government that would come to a negotiated settlement with NATO powers. The Western partners wanted to, I'm sure someone was really worried about what would happen to me if my family, Zelensky said. But someone probably wanted to just end things faster. I think the majority of the people who called me, well, almost everyone, did not have faith that Ukraine can stand up to this and preserve. Similarly, warning Ukrainians to prepare for war, as some partners wanted him to. He said would have weakened the country economically and made it easier for Russians to capture. Let people discuss in the future whether it was right or wrong or not right. The Ukrainian leader recalled. But I definitely know, and intuitively, we discuss this every day at the National Security and Defense Council, et cetera, et cetera. I had a feeling that the Russians wanted to prepare us for a soft surrender of the country, and that was scary.
So does that mean that if he left, like he was worried, he's had some suspicions that those in the West wanted him to leave the country, because that would make it easier for Russia to come in and install a puppet government, and not warning his people, and if he had done that and does damage to the economy, and there's the people have left as well, doesn't that make it easier then for Russia to just come in and you're gonna have to surrender and give it up? Is that what that means?
Yeah, I think there was.
So here he is, a comedian, now a president, and he comes up with a strategy that really worked.
Yeah, if you're fighting a bully and you just walk away or turn to the side, and they'll just dominate you, kind of thing.
Yeah, we aren't going to be able to finish this, so I'm going to mark us here.
Oh, it's already, yeah.
We'll mark us here to back up just a teeny bit there, because I wanted to bring up a point based on what you just said when it comes to the bullies.
Yeah.
There was because this is off topic, a USA article that I read today. We've all heard what's going on with Bud Light, Anheuser-Busch, and Target. Seems like there's another one wasn't Nike somewhat involved as well, but they're backing down in the name of, well, I don't know about Bud Light's a different issue, but Target specifically backed down in response to the threats to employees. But the article that I was reading was giving the examples of those that are not backing down. And it was talking about it being a decision that will be, that's what it was titled, something along the lines, those that do not back down, those that stand up to the bully of the anti-LGBT legislation, those that stand up against it will be on the right side of history. You'd probably find the article if you looked it up, the right side of history in USA Today.
It was I saw an interview, not an interview, but where they were talking about the Bud Light thing, and all the GOP were on board. They were talking bad about Bud Light and all this other kind of stuff, but the Budweiser company sent a letter to the GOP telling them that, we're one of the biggest contributors to the GOP. Maybe you guys forgot about that, and maybe you should rethink about what you guys are doing. And the following week, they stopped bashing Budweiser. So they didn't even know who they were bashing. They were bashing their own people that were contributing to the GOP party and all that. But you haven't heard nothing since. They don't talk about Budweiser anymore. They stopped doing it. And so I don't know. That GOP is just out of control. Out of control.
If you look at the whole picture, pull back the the lens and look at the, you know, as onlookers, understanding what the battle is, and onlookers looking at it, you see these businesses, compare and contrast them. The ones that are like Target is real big on merchandising, selling LGBTQ, selling pride merchandise.
Right.
And now let's say that you're a Target employee and you're transgender or you're gay or lesbian, and you're an employee at Target, and the first thing, you know, the threats come along, and now your employer is pulling back in order to protect you from the threats. And I was thinking about that. I don't know if I know how to express this. When it comes to the battle for equality, when it comes to radical feminism failed because they gave in to the bully.
Yeah.
Feminism can never win if you give in to the bully. You have to face the bully, defuse the bully, or just don't put up with the bully. And so imagine if you're part of the LGBTQ community and you're an employee, you also could look at it in two different ways. You could be there saying, why don't you fight against these bullies? Or you could be saying, oh, I'm so thankful that my employer is protecting me. Which one's going to win the battle? Which attitude is going to win the battle?
The one who fights.
The one who fights, got to face it. So I thought it was interesting that article was kind of touching on some of that as well, saying that the title in the title of the article was that those that do will be on the right side of history. Thought that was an interesting title to it.
And Zelensky went against all odds.
Yeah, he fought against it.
He was the underdog big time.
And he did some serious strategic risky moves, it seems.
Yeah.
That's why it just seems like Providence is guiding. While individuals make choices and make their decisions and act, to me, it seems like we can see, I don't know if anybody else feels that way, you can see the hand of God, because you have, or at least when it comes to Providence, because where did Zelensky get the courage and the moxie to make the decisions that he made?
And the way he got elected, he went against the rich and powerful, the oligarchy of Ukraine. To get into power, he had to go against them first. And he ran on the platform of anti-corruption. He said that if you elect me, he says, I will eliminate the oligarchy out of the political scene. And he did. He even established laws against the oligarchy having any power. They could not contribute money to political groups. They could not hold political positions. And he just wrote up an incredible amount of laws and safeguards for the country, you know. Something I wish America would take a look at. Because we have our own oligarchy here pulling the strings on some of the political stuff that goes on here.
Yeah, I know, and Elder Tess brings that up and talks about there, you have to compare and contrast that, because the far left says, you know, we have oligarchs, Bernie Sanders, look at those oligarchs, but look at what Putin does you know, when she talks about what Putin does is leaving a trail of dead bodies. You don't see that happening over here. So you have to look at it, you have to compare it and contrast it when it comes to you know, looking at the US that way.
Yeah, you can put Musk in there as an oligarchy.
Yeah,
And guys like that, you know, and the guy that has Facebook and all that, all those kind of people.
yeah. Yeah, I got two thoughts here before we close. Jackie put, he knew he had, Zelensky knew he had the West on his side, but I don't know, through this article, it's showing that some of the statements that Zelensky made, he kind of had some skepticism.
Yeah.
On what, you know, whether or not he really had the West behind him. And the non-provocation thing that they never thought was right. In other words, one of you, I don't remember which one said it, put your money where your mouth is and give us all we need to, and we'll do it. And never felt that, didn't feel that they were given, that we were given enough. So there's that. But then the other comment I wanted to make before we close is because Mary said, since the personal is back to the other conversation, personal is political, how do we see liberal feminism failing politically? Well, liberal feminism doesn't fight the patriarchy. So, I mean, they fail because they don't fight the patriarchy. They're happy with the freedom that they have. I know I'm saying that really not clear, but they're not fighting. They're not fighting equality like they ought to.
Just like the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they didn't fight against racism and slavery.
No.
It was the sins, you know, the sins of our sins of the churches, you know, the people who put the church together, kind of thing.
Well, we made a lot further in that article than I thought we would, so that was good. But it seemed like a pretty easy read too, to get to the points. I did write down some dates, and then the page numbers that they're mentioned on, so I can go back through it. But I'm going to watch that video as well, hopefully in the next week or so.
And notice we didn't have to go to the dictionary not once today.
I did once, didn't I? I almost did. There was one word, I think, and then I asked, then Phil answered it, I think. Pincer. I think that was the one. So yeah, Gloria put it in here. She's not here anymore. I want to double check that title to save it. A War of Narratives, is that the one? Yeah. In April 16 of 2022. Oh, good. I'm gonna check, rewatch those ones. I know I need to. Good night, Troy.
I think I missed the link that Gloria put in there. Do you have it?
I just now opened it.
Could you put it back in the, my internet dropped off
Oh yeah, sure.
and I lost the link. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome, thanks.
Jackie said Zelensky had to have faith that God is leading in the cause against Putin and evil. It's just interesting when you go back to Abraham Lincoln. Who was it that recently posted? Somebody just recently posted that article on Lincoln. I think it was in the Bible study thread. I think we talked about that and others read it. But just how, I don't know, I remember it. Because Lincoln really wasn't a religious man, right? That's what I remember reading in that. He wasn't a religious man to begin with.
Yeah.
But going through the Civil War, he understood that God was controlling things. And it's really kind of a mystery because God's controlling things, but it's us that makes our own decisions. So probably, you know, when we go into the study of the wheat and the tares, we're going to look at that a little bit more too, about God doesn't do anything. It's us that do it. What proxy you decide to be with is going to help you make your decisions. but that God doesn't do anything. How do we know that God doesn't do anything? Anybody remember? I don't know, look at that on the Sabbath. Jackie, would you like to close in prayer? Or is Logina there?
I'm here. I can go ahead and pray.
Okay, thank you.
Loving God, as we've been able to gather midweek to share this article, Lord, you continue to teach us, Lord, and to be able to understand and piece together some things that we may have missed as it was happening. But now as we look back, Lord, we know that things are happening, Lord, according to the plan, your great plan, Lord, of restoring our humanity, our world. And Lord, as we have another gathering this Friday and then Sabbath, we ask that you prepare us, that we continue to do our own studies, Lord, and understanding things that are going on around us. Be with those that are traveling, as this is a season of vacations and gatherings of family members and graduations and such. So be with all those traveling, Lord. We ask that you be with us tonight and grant us all a good night's rest. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you.